Okay, great. So now we're streaming on Facebook and we're here on Zoom. Thank you everybody for joining us. This is the second session of the Social Vision Conference. This session is called Verticality and Hasidism Social Ethos. So we're gonna go from 1:30 to 2:30. We'll start off by short presentations from each panelist, and then we'll have a Q&A section at the end. And we'll start off that part by having the panelists speak to each other's presentations, and then we'll open it up to our other participants. So I'll just introduce all three speakers now, and then we'll go in order. Our first speaker is Elliot Wolfson. He's the Marcia and Jay Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies at UC Santa Barbara. Jonathan Garb is the Gershom Shalom Professor of Kabbalah at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Leore Sachs Shmueli is the Golda Meir Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a lecturer in the Department of Jewish Thought at Bar Ilan University. So we will start off with Professor Wolfson.
Okay, thank you. I thought I would just start by kind of defining the use of verticality and social vision, just to get us going here. So put simply, it's the awareness that a divine dynamic is at play in society, and therefore a social ethos will be grounded in the sense of an absolute that, as Philip puts it on page 192, endows individuals with a moral purpose that makes their individuated personhood an irreducible absolute. So the interpersonal does not extend.
Sorry, I'm interrupting. Elliot, could you please look into the camera so we can see you? Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard because I'm reading from my notes. So, all right, I'll try to do the best I can. Is this better?
Mm-hmm.
So the interpersonal, I was saying, does not only extend horizontally, but it extends vertically as well. And for the Rebbe, this means extending to the essence of the infinite, Atzmut Ein Sof, which is in fact the only true reality. So the social and the spiritual realms cannot be bifurcated. That's an essential point of social vision. Now, according to Philip, this conception of moral, what he calls moral verticality of personhood, is the basis for Schneerson's Jewish humanism. And I just want to unpack in the few minutes that I have here this curious turn of phrase, Jewish humanism. Now, it's Philip's presumption in this book and in other books that the sociological lens can filter out social concepts that adhere in the Jewish mystical tradition, identifying them and translating them into a more universally applicable idiom. And this is what's underlying this notion of Jewish humanism. So this allows Philip to speak of humanity without specifying the precise connotation of this term in Chabad thinking. Now this touches upon the question of the universal and the particular, which I believe is the subject for another panel. But it must be said that this whole notion of verticality and the way it encompasses Jew and non-Jew can't really be assessed without taking into consideration what the relationship is. Is the universal indexical of the particular, or the particular indexical of the former? This is a crucial question. Now, I don't have time to unpack this, but I think that here the social cannot be separated from the thinking that's going on in Chabad, going all the way back to the Alter Rebbe, Shneer Zalman, the way he understands the essence of the Ein Sof, which again is the only one true reality. He puts it in one place in, I believe it's from his Sidur, commentary in the Sidur, Bechinat HaKlal Shekolel HaRibui. So the infinite is the aspect of the universal that comprises the multiplicity. And this isn't simply in the usual way it's understood that the one encompasses the many and that the many emanate or derive from the one, but rather I think more profoundly that the oneness of the one is indeed constituted by the multiplicity, right? So we could say it in this way: it's the indivisibility of the infinite that not only engenders limitless divisibility, but the limitless divisibility is precisely what constitutes the nature of the indivisibility of the infinite. I have here passages from the Rashab, which are very important in developing this idea, but I'm going to skip them now to get to my main point. It's still my contention that this social vision and this notion of a Jewish humanism must be scrutinized carefully with respect to the anthropological question of what is the nature of humanity, what is Adam. So there are 5 points I want to make here, which would question somewhat the thesis. First, the rabbinic idea that Adam was created yachid, singularly, as if not to privilege any one ethnic identity, is really undermined in the Rebbe's teachings and in all of Chabad literature as far as I'm aware. Because what this rabbinic or Agadic tradition signifies is that Israel is the singular representation and the most epitomizes what it is to be Adam. Atem kruyim Adam ve'enu mot ha'olam kruyim Adam. You, Israel, are called Adam and not the nations of the world, or according to another version, not the idolatrous nations. This is enhanced by a Lurianic teaching, which we find occasionally in the Rebbe's writings or discourses, that the original intention was, and prior to the sin of Adam and Eve, all of the nations were comprised in Adam. They did not have distinct ethnic identities. Second point, love your neighbor as yourself is understood by the Rebbe in line with Maimonides of all people to refer to the Jew and not to humanity at large. Third, the idea of the 7 Noachide laws, which undoubtedly is a very important idea and which seeks to include the non-Jews in the Messianic drama. That is for sure the case, but it nevertheless still preserves an unbridgeable gap between Jew and non-Jew. 4, there is an aspect of the Jewish soul that simply is not found in the non-Jew. And I do not see that the Rebbe ever deviated from this point. And this is the aspect that is called Yechidah, which relates to the essence of Ein Sof. And in virtue of this aspect, the Jew can be attached to and incorporated in the infinite, which in the final analysis is the nature of Messianic consciousness. As I put it in Open Secret, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, one might say, the Jew has what it takes to be nothing. That is, one must be something in order to be nothing, and to thereby experience the overcoming of all difference, even the difference between Jew and non-Jew. 5, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated, because it is the case that the Rebbe does on occasion speak of the Messianic future as a time in which the non-Jew will be transformed into holiness, and the non-Jew will also, non-Jews will also recognize that all existence is divine, that nature itself will be revealed as godly. That's their understanding of the prophetic tradition that in the future, the king will be revealed without any garment. It's not the dissolution of nature, but the concealment that is the world will finally be revealed as the concealment, and therefore one discerns that all of nature is divine. Now, I readily admit this point, but if one actually thinks about this and ponders it carefully, what is really being articulated here? Does the Messianic vision call for the overcoming of the difference by non-Jew and Jew through the non-Jew losing what is the essence of the non-Jew, becoming somewhat incorporated into the sense of Jewishness. That's something to think about. So one final point. We get the impression we get from this book is that Schneerson demonstrated that Hasidism is not alien to American culture. Now, is this so? I think the answer here is yes and no. Right? And I want to end with even the idea, let me say, that all people are created in God's image is more complicated. Surely the Rebbe, when he talked to people like David Dinkins, made this point. But when we look more carefully into his teachings, we see that, like the Maharal, this does not obfuscate the difference between Jew and non-Jew. The tselem, the image, is not the same for Jew and non-Jew. And I want to end with an anecdote that illustrates this point. In a talk from the summer of 1960, the Rebbe gave to the children of the camp Gan Yisrael, he told the story of the Baal Shem Tov and the Gentile wagon driver in order to illustrate the meaning of Ben Zoma's teaching in Pirkei Avot, Ezeu Chacham Halomei Mikol Adam, who is wise, the one who learns from every person. So the story very quickly is, one time a wagon got stuck in the mud, and the non-Jewish driver looked into the Besh synagogue, Shtibel, and he asked the disciples to help him pull out the wagon. And they said they weren't strong enough. To which the Gentile replied, "You are strong enough, but you simply don't want to do it." From this, the Besh derives that it's a fundamental lesson about Avodas Hashem, the worship of God, that the strength is always granted by God, but it finally depends on the will of the person. But if one listens to the talk, one hears that in the beginning of the story, the Rebbe says, a Jew can learn about Avodas Hashem from a guy, lahavdil. So the very point of the story is upended by that term lahavdil. It bridges the otherness by maintaining the other's otherness. And I think when one reflects on what is promulgated in the social vision, one has to think very hard about that semiotic signifier, lahavdil. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot, for your talk. Now we're going to hear from Jonathan Garb. Please go ahead.
Social vision is a genuine breakthrough. I'd like to frame the context of this breakthrough, that it's a commonplace that the study of Hasidism is rather sharply bifurcated between the more phenomenological, theological approach and the more socio-historical approach. Now, within the sociological approach to Hasidism, the usual idea is to interpret Hasidism according to sociological theory, in other words, according to the products of Western academe, most of which was created in the 20th century. Now, what Wexler does is to reverse, it's almost like a Copernican shift. He says, rather than interpret Hasidism through sociological theory, use Hasidism as a resource for sociological theory. So I'd like to put it in my own terms that Wexler is basically asking us to position Hasidism and the giants of sociology or 20th century sociology, such as Weber or Durkheim, to put them side by side rather than giving any hierarchical preference to one over the other. And from his point of view, it's no more logical to interpret Durkheim according to Chabad. It's more just as logical to interpret Durkheim or Weber according to Chabad than to interpret Chabad according to Durkheim and Weber. Because why? And again, I'm using it now, my terms, not Philip's terms, because they're both products of the 20th century. And I think there's a phrase that I think, using the language of a Rebbe himself, of a Ramam, as I'll henceforth refer to him, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, he says, Torah innovation is historically situated. Of course, this is not what the Ramam meant by when he made that statement. I'm using his language in order to say that what Wexler is showing is the deep historical situation of sociological theory, which enables him to put sociological theory and Hasidism in a more horizontal rather than vertical relationship. Now, there he's actually, I think that Philip, if to put him in a wider frame, is joining the move, which I think has been commenced by Elliot Wolfson and by Anthony Steinbock, whose book on verticality is basically referred to in the title of the session, that both of them see that Chabad can be a resource for understanding religion in a comparative sense, in a theoretical sense. Elliot is turning more to the Eastern traditions, in certain Buddhist traditions in his Open Secret, and Anthony Steinbock is going more to Western, classical Western monotheistic traditions, but it's basically a similar move. And I want to put Philip together with this move. It is saying that Chabad is actually, whether it's early Chabad like Steinbock's book or later Chabad, in case of Elliot or Philip, Chabad is actually a resource for theoretical innovation, which is why I use the quote from the Rebbe about innovation. Now, I think it is very interesting the turn to the East, or turn to Buddhism in Open Secret, because the Rebbe was one of the thinkers who in the 1960s was one of the first people inside the Jewish world to give a response to the idea of the influence of Buddhist meditation on American culture in the revolution of the 1960s. So I want to zoom in now and to position the Rebbe as part of a history of American religion, which is a move also Shaul Magid makes, and specifically the context of the 1960s. Now, the 1960s, the whole turbulence, the whole social unrest of the 1960s were, of course, also a formative period also for the young Philip Wexler. I think there's a sort of autobiographical element in his discussion quite early in the book of the 1960s. Now, Wexler quotes a quote from the crucial year of 1967. 1967 is a very important year because this is the year that the Rebbe was really propelled into the forefront of Israeli public attention. And the Rebbe, he notes how the Rebbe diagnoses the unrest of the 60s, and he speaks about the lack of conciliation between the mind and the heart. So I want to focus in now on the question of a conciliation between the mind and the heart and related to verticality, this time as a concept, not just as a book title, and to speak about the mind and the heart of what I would call psychosomatic or psychophysical verticality. We've got in classical Chabad already in the Alter Rebbe, already in Sefer Atanya, we have the idea of a head ruling the heart, which is something which, of course, the Rebbe refers to in this 1967 talk, but especially the idea of the Rebbe himself as the head, that the Rebbe is the initials, the acronym Rosh Bnei Israel, yes, the left is Rebbe, that the Rebbe is the head of the people of Israel, and the head really rules the entire body. So this is the verticality. We've got the head, which rules the heart, the Rebbe, which rules the people. That's the theological model or the psychological model of the mind and the heart, and the sociological model of the Rebbe ruling the people. Now, in later Chabad thought this is modified. There's a three-dimensional idea of the depth of the heart. That's more in the Rebbe Rasha, but let's go back to Wexler rather than, if we get into the whole field of later Chabad, we'll stray off the track. So I want to stay with this 1967 talk, and I want to speak about the question of ritual. Now, the word ritual doesn't appear in the index. It doesn't play a major role in social vision, but it has an important role in social vision. And he uses a very good formulation in page 57. He writes, ritual observance is a fundamental mechanism for the regulated conciliation of the mind and the heart. So social unrest comes because of lack of conciliation of the mind and the heart, and ritual is a mechanism for the regulated conciliation of the mind and heart. And then he put it earlier on Wexler, Ramam really did see the ritual structures of the Torah lifestyle as channels for suitable transformation of human consciousness. Now, channel is a very important idea because channel means, again, flow, vertical flow from top to below. That's the idea of a channel, especially in Kabbalah and Hasidut. And the idea that the ritual is what connects the higher and the lower, creates a channel, a transformative channel, as Wexler puts it. Now, he shows there that the Rebbe saw the first of his 10 campaigns, his Mivtzaim, the Tefillin campaign, as a mechanism to bring about the conciliation of the mind and the heart, because the Tefillin, the head Tefillin for the mind, the hand Tefillin for the heart, the connection, which is symbolized by the chords. And this is what will repair the social unrest of the 1960s. Now, this is exactly the same trope that he used in the Six-Day War, because he said that the head Tefillin, based on the Talmudic saying, he said the head Tefillin will lead to the victory in the Six-Day War. So his famous, one could call it prophecy of the swift Israeli victory in the Six-Day War was based on this idea of the Tefillin as creating the deterrence and creating the victory. Now, I have a historical comment that another great 20th century Jewish mystic, Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen Cook, he actually launched his career with a mission tour throughout Jewish communities in Eastern Europe to propagate the correct observance of tefillin. In the case of a Rebbe in 1967, it's already that people should put on tefillin at all. In the case of Rav Kook, it's just they should put him in the right place on the head. It's the head tefillin. That is his focus. And this is his first book. Chavash Pe'er, his first book was a book about tefillin. So we could do almost a history here of a ritual object. That is, we can take a material history in a sense, but from a Rebbe's point of view, I think material history and intellectual history are one, in the terms described before by Elliot, that the material world itself will reveal divinity or become opaque in a sense to divinity in a very complex dialectical process. But the bottom line is the material world will reveal divinity. So the material and intellectual history are one. So the history of a tefillin as a material object is also the history of ritual, the history of a head and a heart, and so on and so forth. So now this goes far beyond, I think, using Wexler's own methodology, we can say that Durkheim put the totem, the ritual object, in the center of his sociology of religion. And here we can find an indigenous Hasidic approach to the ritual object as the center of religion through following the 20th century history of tefillin. Now, since it's almost physically impossible for me to speak without referring to a text, I'll draw a near conclusion by referring to a later talk from 1967, Parashat Mishpatim. When I put this up on my website, I'll put in all the footnotes, of course. And the Rebbe poses a tremendous question, yes? Gewaltige Kushia Tzuma. If the ultimate truth, and this echoes actually the Buddhist theory that you've got a relative truth and absolute truth. So he says, if the ultimate truth is that the parchment of tefillin, and he says tefillin is just a model here for the whole Torah, is already divine. So how can the Torah of truth claim that the parchment is mundane until you do the whole process that the scribe has to write it, L'Shem Tefillin, with all the special laws of tefillin, and has to make it holy? The parchment is already holy. And you can't say the Torah is only referring to our relative perspective, because it's a Torah of truth. So the Torah cannot negate the absolute truth that the parchment of tefillin is already holy. And he says, furthermore, from a point of view of ultimate truth, there's no ink and there's no parchment. That is, the very existence of separate objects, such as ink and parchment, is negated. Or in the language of a movie, The Matrix, there is no spoon. So there is no tefillin, there is no ink, there is no parchment. So I agree with Rebbe that this is a very powerful kushia. I don't want to go into the answer. The answer is very complex. It's tens of pages, this answer. I'll just say a teaser that it's a very complicated analysis of the 7th chapter of the second part of Tanya, Shara Yichud Ve'emunah. But I want to say how this quote shows that the Rebbe is a radical theological thinker that we see in his question. The fact that he takes such trouble to answer the question shows that he's also deeply committed, as Elliot has also shown, to a certain Jewish tradition, to a tradition of Chabad, to the tradition of the entire chain of Jewish tradition, which in some way constrains his radicality. And there's a tension, it's a creative tension between his own theological thrust and between the situation in which he operates, which is not just the situation of 1967 of America and so on and so forth. Or as the previous Rebbe said, the 6th Rebbe, America is not different. So if America is not different, it means to say the situation we find ourselves now is part of the totality of the Jewish tradition and has to be continuous with it. So now, Philip in 193 in his book, he speaks about the enmeshment of divinity of every human action in which each person has the power to turn divinity against itself. I think it's also a very radical theological statement, and I'm grateful to Philip for uncovering or for underlining the statement that the Rebbe is basically saying that human beings can turn the divine against itself. Again, it's a very radical theology. And I think one of the achievements of the book is to show that such a radical theologian can also be a social leader. And a social leader has all kinds of constraints, and some of them are indeed conservative constraints. I think the book, in a way, pushes the progressive aspects of a Rebbe. He uses the word progressive in a book, which is a very charged word today in America. But of course, it's a very strong conservative function operating here as well, which I think one could write almost a mirror book for social vision to show the Rebbe as a conservative thinker. It's a bit like Neil Postman. He wrote, education is a subversive activity, and then he wrote a few years later, education is a conservative activity. I'm looking forward to Philip's book on the Rebbe as a conservative figure. Now, as the Mishnaic story, which is in the context of the holidays of Tishrei coming up, says, Yoter mima shekarati lifnechem yesh kan. Katuv kan. Yes, more than what I've read to you is written here. There's much more in this book than what I could do justice to in these few words, but I hope this will illustrate how Philip can galvanize and tantalize and really arouse discussion and further discussion, and I wish him that he should further this discussion himself, and that all of us should join in it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll say amen to that. Very nice, thank you. Okay, Leore, your turn. Please take it away. Please unmute yourself.
Could I share my screen, please?
Sure. Do you see that option at the bottom? It's
But it's disabled.
Okay, let me just take a look at that.
Okay, while you're enabling my screen, I would like to start. I'm very honored and humbled as well to be part of this panel with the world-renowned Kabbalah scholars who are my teachers, Professor Elliot Wolfson and Professor Jonathan Garb, and I hope that I'm able to contribute something for this discussion that is worthwhile on such a profound topic as verticality and Hasidism social ethos. Is my screen good? Let's see. One moment. Okay, it will take me another moment to start my screen. In the meanwhile, social vision, like some of the previous works by Professor Wexler, demonstrate that the social application of Jewish mystical ideas, that is, ideas have power to transform and shape social change and organization. And in this period of virtual social connectedness that we are experiencing, it's very interesting to think how this virtual and reality has implication of how we experience society. So due to different vision of core values, they suggest, the authors of this book, that the culture, the Hasidic culture offers a valuable alternative to capitalist Western culture, albeit their shared context. And in this, the writers are not only aspiring to observe and explain the social visions of the subject matter of their study, but through writing, publicizing, and convening a conference like this, they participating themselves in the social change and vision that they're writing about. They're not only communicating the social goals and innovations they observe in Lubavitcher's social vision, but they also identify themselves with these goals and demonstrate how they are crafting a social vision in the way they're translating the Hasidic ideas from Yiddish to English, from Hasidic and mystical languages to sociological and universal language. And in this act, they're participating in maybe Chabad outreach goals in the adaptation of the social vision and a call for social change. So this is my general remark, and now I want to focus on more specific. But why can't I see my? Let's see again. Okay. Can you see my screen now? Okay.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you. Okay, so what I want to do in this lecture is contextualize the three loves, which are one, it's the mystical idea cited in social vision, and offer some observation about the context, the sources, and contemporary adaptations, and finish with a short observation of a suggestion for further research and beyond the Rebbe's vision to actual Hasidim. So I'm focusing on one passage cited in page 83 that discusses the three loves. The first thing people want to hear, so the Rebbe is saying the statement in Yiddish, and I'll show the Yiddish soon after this slide. When he arrives to America in 1951, he needs to choose a statement. And he's aware that this statement, people are looking to hear for something innovative, something provocative.
And the statement he chooses to talk about is this: there is love of God, and there is love of Torah, and there is love of the Jewish people. And these three things are all one. And the authors of the book bring this statement because the Rebbe is aware of the social statement, and he's also elaborates the importance of the love for human beings, or the Jewish people, in order to attain the higher goal of love of God, and it has to go through human beings. And now I would like to raise a question of the competing loves, and the saying that all loves are one does not recognize the tension between different loves, and like people experience the tension and conflictual love, types of love, environment versus Jewish community versus animals, religious, myself, and all these different loves do not get treated in a more conflictual way, but are unified into one love. And Professor Wolfson has elaborated in his previous talk about the paradox and the conflict between the Jewish chosenness and who are we commanded to love, when there is the commandment of love, who is included and who is excluded. And although the book aspires to an universal agenda, the particularism and the chosenness of the Jewish people is a core conflict in this ideology, and it's deep rooted in medieval times, and I will touch upon it a little later. And I wanted, before we continue, to bring the original of the text, and it's not really a text. Sichot Kodesh is rewriting of students that wrote what they heard from the Rebbe, and it was in Yiddish, and I thought it would be nice to see the original. So the Rebbe Kommunikät in Amerika hat gesagt, da in Amerika hat man lieb Herrn Akruz, הדבר חידוש, noch besser, הדבר המבהיל את הרעיון, es heißt a statement. And then he doesn't know if it's really radical, but he knows that's what people expect him when he comes to America. And then he says, דדרי אהבות, אהבת השם, אהבת הסורה, התורה ונאהבת ישראל, כל אחד. מכן נטפון פונותר silence vision זה, warum sie ist כל אחד, ואין in עצם. So essentially, they're all one in their essence. Und das sein Achut המשולש, was לא ינתק, und das wird euch bringen zu der Geula. So there's a messianic spice from the beginning. The statement, by practicing it, by actualizing it, will bring the Geula, the Messiah. So I would like to shed some light on the source of this saying. This dictum was in research was supposed to be the best idea, but Isaiah Tishby showed in his article that this idea, Kucha Brichu, Raita V'Israel Kul Echad, is in the Ramchal, the Italian modern Kabbalist, and Mitnagdim and Hasidim use these statements, and it's not just a Hasidic idea. So it's interesting for me when we explore social vision as a Hasidic vision. Are there differences between Mitnagdim applications of the social ideas of Kabbalah, or they share a common social ethos? And Mendel Pekaj, in his book Between Ideology and Reality, shows the problematic way that Hasidic reading of this mystical idea of love of friends, and like Professor Wolfson noted, who is included in this love of friends, and the neighbor is only the Jew. And also I think Professor Garb talked about the organism, that the head is the Rebbe, is loved more than the toes. So even in this idea of love, it's not an egalitarian love. There's a hierarchy between the different parts and limbs in this organism. And how do modern people that live today could identify with these hierarchical ideas is a question for readers of this book. And because Professor Wolfson spoke more about this, the roots of this idea, I will just summarize. In Open Secret, Professor Wolfson writes this when he summarized the paradox between Jewish chosenness and universal responsibility. One should be struck straight away by a balanced contradiction. On the one hand, the intrinsic nature of the Jew, in contrast to the non-Jew, is tagged as the ability to be integrated in the essence, and we saw the etzem before in Yiddish, the essence. But on the other hand, in that essence, opposite are no longer distinguishable, whence it should follow that the division between Jew and non-Jew should itself be subject to subversion. I'm not sure this is reconciled, and the competing loves are reconciled in the Rebbe's framework, but we have more experts than myself to answer this question. What I would like to ask, one of the arguments of this book that the core values of Hasidism apply to different social organization, different sociological ideas, but the commandment to love is also shared with the Christians. So we see the works of love is a very profound commandment, and also the idea of the organism is shared with the ecclesia. The idea of the Christian church as one organism and is the manifestation of the divine essence. So in what way would we explain the difference in the capitalistic ideas in Christianity and the different sociological ideas in the Jewish Hasidism if they share this idea of the holy body of the group, of the community as a manifestation that excludes others? I would like to hear more insights about this. And also in this holy body, the king also has a different, a special place, and we could maybe compare the king's role and the Messiah or Rebbe's role. Another contemporary I would like to suggest, and Professor Garb also talked about the cook, and he wrote a lot about it, but contemporary mystical leader that also was a social leader and had a lot of influence in Israel was Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son of Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook. And comparing between the Rebbe Lubavitcher and Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Cohen Kook emphasizes the difference between the mystical translation of the Kabbalistic text and for diaspora Judaism and versus for Zionist national mysticism. So in 1917, it's a few years, I'm sorry, it's not 1917, sorry, it's 1957. It's my mistake, 1957, a few years apart from the passage we read from Schneerson. In a talk of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda for Ezra, a youth group, he speaks about the two essential points, and this is my translation. The acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven is unified and grow through the Torah, and this is unified and the unity, Achdut Israel, their love of their fraternity, Vatachvatam, that is unified and grows in the land of Israel. So he ties this unification between the Torah, the yoke of heaven, Avat Israel, the three loves, the God, Israel, and the Torah, but he adds a component in the land of Israel that we don't find in Lubavitcher Rebbe. So I think comparing them and putting them in this context emphasize the difference in translating this mystical Kabbalistic idea for Zionist Jews versus diaspora Jewishness. And it's interesting, if we spoke about the love the particular love versus universal love, to read Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda's father, and his attempt to configure love for all creatures beyond the Jewish nation, but he also has this tradition of Jewish chosenness, and he writes a few passages that were collected in his work Midot HaRaya. Most of them are from the first Kovetz from Shmona Kovetzim. I put here only one passage that also talks about these three loves that we spoke about, but instead of the love of Israel, he talks about the love of all creatures. So I'll read shortly. It is impossible not to love God, and it is impossible that this power of sweet love does not nurture a practical outcome. To love, to act in practice, in deeds, and I'm sorry, this translation is, I wrote it quickly today, but I'll continue. It is impossible not to love Torah and the commandments. It is impossible not to be full of love to every creature. So we have here the love of God in the beginning, the love of Torah, but he transitions and changes instead of love of Israel, he speaks now love of all creatures. And this is another topic to compare the mystical translation of the sociological and social ethos of mystical traditions and how they are moderated in different modern contexts. I will finish with a short note that one of the most interesting things that were analyzed in the book is the Aleph Institute and the idea of prisons and the Rebbe and Lubavitcher participation in a social change in the incarnation of prisoners. And what I found interesting about this is that here in this chapter, the authors not only cited the Rebbe's ideas, but also the Aleph Institute and their website. And I think this is a promising direction for future research to, if we're interested in social vision and in social and mystical society, to move beyond the Rebbe's vision and investigate and observe Hasidim themselves. How do they understand their social mystical ideas, and how do they practice these ideas? And these days are give the opportunity that a Kabbalah scholar of medieval times or even early modern times don't have this various data and research and media to investigate the rank and file, the ordinary people. And I would like to hear more about how Hasidim live the ethos of mystical society. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you everyone for your presentations. This morning in our first session for Social Vision, we had 3 very diverse topics and we were able to weave them together in our discussion. I think here it will be a lot clearer that each person spoke about something very related, and I think the conversations flowed together very nicely. So now we'll open up the floor to our panelists to reflect, respond, ask questions, and then we'll take other questions.
Well, if no one else has a burning question, maybe I've got one question for Elliot and a question and comment for Leore. My question for Elliot is, when the Rebbe did something quite remarkable, because a lot of people, let's say in Chabad and otherwise, were not entirely happy with David Dinkins, the first black mayor, I think, of New York City, especially in the background of the Crown Heights riots. And then when the Rebbe came and said, we want people. So the usual Chabad interpretation of that is a bit like Rav Soloveitchik's statements that he said one people in the sense of citizenship. Just like Rav Soloveitchik says that the commonality of a non-Jewish world is in joint citizenship, but not in our religious life. So my question to Elliot is, do you agree with this Chabad interpretation, or do you think the Rebbe said something more radical at that moment?
Thank you for that. I think it's similar to Soloveitchik in the sense that we still have to maintain some dichotomy here. And I wouldn't say it's dissimilitude. I think when the Rebbe spoke this way in relationship to Dinkins, and also when Dinkins came for one of the, the dollars, getting a dollar, the Rebbe said to him, we're all created in the divine image. But still, there is a dichotomy here. He wasn't revealing completely, what is at the core of his thinking. However, it's different in Soloveitchik because the Rebbe did, through the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, intensively and aggressively try to rope in the non-Jew in the Messianic drama. So we can't maintain that distinction that Soloveitchik maintained. It somewhat breaks down. And that leads to what, as you pointed out, and I think Leore also points out, to a very creative tension. There's a very creative tension here. So when I spoke of the problems of the Lahavdil, it wasn't to denigrate, but it was only to accentuate the complexity and really the creative tension that is in the Rebbe's teaching.
Okay, thank you. I think it clarifies for me at least. Leore, since you're more of a medievalist than I am, I wanted to ask if you think, just following on what you said, whether you think, for instance, the term in the Zohar, Gufa de Malka, the body of God, the body of a king, is related to the idea of medieval ideas of the body of a king, and to the idea of Corpus Christi, the idea of the church as God's body. That's a question. And my comments, when you speak about the Rav Tziyuda, it's very interesting because seemingly Rav Tziyuda, the whole triangle of Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Torat Yisrael, you probably know the song, yes? So this whole triangle seems to replace the triangle of God, the Torah and Israel. Basically, the land of Israel replaces God, which Rav Harlap, for instance, another student of Rav Kook, said that basically the land of Israel is God in a way, yes. But actually in 1967, in the same year, the Rebbe's got a talk in which he does speak about the triangle of a land, the people, and the Torah. And he speaks very, very strongly. It's I think one of his strongest pro-Eretz Israel statements in the whole corpus, precisely in 67. I can't remember if it's before the war or after the war. If it's after the war, of course, it's very significant. If it's before the war, maybe a bit less. Anyway, so that's my comment, and then there's a question. You're on mute. I think you muted. It's it.
So the triangle of Avat Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, and Am Yisrael is something in youth groups, Bnei Akiva grow up on this triangle. And I looked for its sources, and it's from a Mizrahi conference in, I think, 1907. And so it was even before mystical ideas, or maybe it's on the subtext. So yes, it's a very interesting, and and it's an interesting note that the Rabbi Lubavitcher himself also expressed this. And about the Gufa de Malka, it's an interesting. I never thought about that in this context, but the idea of the organic body is very prevalent in medieval texts, in the Zohar and Rabbi Yosef Abba Mishushan that I studied, and it has very close relations to the ideas of the ecclesia, and maybe it's the way of Jewish people to adapt these ideas. So I think it is parallel. Maybe Professor Wolfson has something to add.
No, I agree with you. The only thing I would add here is, well, I don't want to open a can of worms here, but the gender dimension is very significant because the Corpus Christi is the church, but the church is also assimilated to the image of Mary. So analogously, there's an interesting relationship here between Gufa de Malka as Tiferet or HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Shekhinah. That's the only thing I would add. I mean, there's much more to say on that, but
would you say Gufa de Malka is only Tiferet, or the Guf is the Shechina and the Malka is Tiferet, and she becomes the vessel of? And usually when they talk about the Guf, it is the soul of Israel comprised the limbs of Shechina. And
exactly.
So,
I totally agree. But I didn't want to get into it, but thank you. That's what's going on here. Yeah, I agree.
So I just want to jump in. There's another source. I read a letter from the Rebbe about someone who wrote to him about how to deal with anti-Semitism. And his response was that the world should know that we come from Adam, from one person. And the reason why, he said in this letter, the reason why God created that all humanity should stem from one person, rather than God creating each nation coming from a separate body, is to know that we're ultimately one. And there's more that unites us and divides us. So it's interesting to look in different places and to see this tension, as you were saying, because it's certainly there, but I also think that the Rebbe's vision for possibly America in particular was that there should be ways in which that tension is overcome in order to bring the Hasidic ethos into American culture specifically. So if you're thinking about the Rebbe's idea of having a moment of silence in schools, that's something that's deeply rooted in his vision of bringing a recognition of God into society. That's in a way universal. But speaking of the 60s, there's another story where a hippie comes to the Rebbe and says, "Where is God?" It's just a famous story. He says, "Where is God?" over and over, and the Rebbe keeps telling him he's in every place, he's in all these things. And then the man says, "Well, what about Jewish particularism?" That really bothers him. And the Rebbe says, the goal of a Jew is to be a Jew. The goal of a black man is to be who he is as a black man. The goal of an Indian man is to be who he is as an Indian man. And so there is this concept of an essence that is unique to a Jew, and then an essence that we were saying is also unique to a non-Jew. And I thought that was very interesting, Professor Wolfson, when you were saying that to subsume the non-Jew into the essence of the Jew would then remove the essence of the non-Jew. So there are things to look into more there. And one last note, I think, Leore, I'm an ethnographer. That's kind of my background. And so I think looking at what the Hasidim do is very important in this regard. I remember thinking it was fascinating when COVID happened. I believe it was during the month of Ramadan. And a lot of the shluchim in Africa were distributing packages of food to Muslims. And it's interesting in general that there are a lot of African countries have Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins that are there, and a lot of the work they do is with non-Jews in those places. And so it's interesting to see how they reconcile that with their mission as emissaries of the Rebbe. So there's a lot more to look at. It looks like we have someone in the audience raising his hand. Let's see. Nathaniel Berman would like to join us. I think that worked. There we go.
Should I go?
Sure,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay. I just want to thank everybody for these amazing talks. Really is an honor to listen to them. I have so many questions, but let me just ask something about the current intellectual climate, and really get triggered by something Chava just said, right? And very, very much provoked by Elliot's amazing talk. As well as the historically locating it in the 60s, like that Joni said. There was a time in the United States when the issue was between universalism and particularism, and that's certainly still true today. And that was certainly a thing in the 60s and 70s, the upsurge of ethnic pride, and so on and so forth. The current intellectual moment, at least among the younger generation, in my experience of it as a college professor, is that is no longer where the the real tension is. The real tension for people is mixed identities, trans identities, not only in terms of gender, but in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion, in terms of all sorts of things. It's the crossovers. It's the place where identities move into each other. And that's a very different intellectual moment, again, especially among the younger generation, than the older particularism, universalism thing. And rightly or wrongly, and perhaps I'm wrong, I see in the Zohar, precisely because it's a poetic text, that it has the resources to collapse the dichotomies, maybe reading against the intention of its authors. But I think the text has resources in it for collapsing some of those dichotomies. And really triggered by the last thing you said, Chava, about how everyone their goal is to be true to their essence. And again, I see the current intellectual moment is very much propelled by a rebellion against essence and a desire for crossovers, trans identities on all kinds of planes, giving rise to controversies, for example, about cultural appropriation. But that itself is a symptom of a period of mixing. And I wondered if there's, basically I'm looking for responses by all of you. Thank you.
Can I respond? I would like to respond because I wanted to also respond to the previous comments, but I'll tie it together. I think you're absolutely right, Nathaniel. From the point of view of the Rebbe, this is a disaster. This mixing, this obliteration of boundaries. It's really Bavel, right? So when he says to someone that to uphold, it's the essence of the Jew is to be a Jew, the essence of black men is to be black men, and so on, I think this is directly related to their idea of the Atzmut Ein Sof as being a one that is constituted by Ribui. However, he doesn't ever fully disclose the other side of the story in these contexts. So when he writes in that letter, that notion that we all come from one Adam, that is somewhat disingenuous to another side of his understanding that Atem kruyim Adam ve'enu moto olam kruyim Adam. He also upholds that teaching, right? So I know people hate me for constantly saying this, and I hate myself for constantly having to say it, but it needs to be said. Good to see you.
Well, Leore, if Leore doesn't have okay, so well, thank you, Nathaniel. I need to think about this, of course, more. I'll just say, I don't think only the Rebbe would be a bit horrified by this situation of mixing. I think if we speak about the Zohar, I think the book Tikkunei Zohar, for him, the image of mixing is a very negative image. It's the Erev Rav. Asaf Tamari has a nice article. He chases the whole history of this, and I think there are contemporary responses, semi-contemporary responses to the mixing. Of course, not to America, more to things in Israel. For instance, somebody like Israel Eliyahu Weintraub, that for him, basically, almost anybody outside Kolel Chazon Ish or Erev Rav. So for him, of course, for him, the Erev Rav is the Cook Circle, is the Mizrahi, that they want to mix Torah and nationalism and so on and so forth.
I agree with the comments before me. I see in the Zohar the talk about the 70 Sarim, the angels that are essential entities to signify the essential difference between the different nations. And there are interesting intermingling through the Pilegesh and concubine that I go back to Rabbi Yosef Abba-Mishran. He speaks about the concubine and the way that Gentile seeds go into Israel through Ruth and other mothers, and he sees a redemption through this. But doesn't collapse, or it's more, if swallows the Gentiles in Israel more than respects the otherness as a pure entity, because these entities are always demonized, and I don't need to tell you, you're an expert about the demonizing of the other in these traditions. So I would say that modern mystical social leaders have a very problematic traditions to work with, and to ascend beyond them into a postmodern society is a very big challenge. And I'm not sure there are yet leaders that are able to reconcile between, and I think what social vision attempts to do is they say maybe we shouldn't reconcile, maybe there's a different ethos that we have that is different than this universalism. But as a modern Orthodox Jew, I think for me it's not easy, and here I prefer a more safe base as a scholar, just talking about what they think and not what my personal opinions are.
Okay, Jonah, do you want to hop in? Because we're reached the end of our session.
Cool, thank you. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for that great question, Professor Berman. I think this got to an amazing ending, because this is actually going to be the topic of the next panel starting at 3. It's going to be exploring the Rebbe. It's between the Rebbe universal and particular. So please come back into the Zoom room in half an hour, go bathroom break and get a snack, because we have another hour. Great.
There are people that still have questions. Maybe we could extend a little the question and answer time.
After the next session, there's going to be some time people can rejoin the room and hang out. But just give people a break. Everyone can leave now, and those people can maybe ask a question while we wait for the next session to start. But just for everyone, this is the official end of the session, and we'll stop streaming now, and then we'll give people room to ask questions now, and also know that later in the evening or wherever your time zone is, after the next session, we'll have time for people to schmooze and talk. So thank you so much for coming to the session. And yeah, I can, everyone is officially dismissed or whatever, but we can finish up with these last few questions.
Okay.
I'll bring in, oh, I am not a co-host. So Denise, can you bring in Larry Schiffman? Oh, now I'm a co-host. Excellent, thank you. Here, this should be, I think we only have about like 10 minutes before we have to prepare for the next one. But I do want to get these questions in as well. So I think Professor Schiffman should be coming into our room right now. May take a second. There we go.
Second. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay.
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, now we can see you.
Okay, so you know what the trick is with all this? You see everybody's books, whatever books are behind them. So, okay, I want to thank everybody for these presentations, and there's a part of this that overlaps with what I'm going to be saying in the 3 o'clock session. But I wanted to make one point that I think is very important in all this discussion, and that is that every single form of Judaism that exists up until today, from ancient times, has to deal with the tension of this issue of particularism versus universalism. And in fact, it starts in the Tanakh and it runs in Chazal and everything else. And the truth is that I think to a great extent, what you're getting in the Rebbe's presentation of this, and I had the advantage of rereading Elliot's material on this just 2 days ago, what you think that you're getting to a great extent is the Kabbalistic / Hasidic reflection of this issue. Now, sometimes it sounds more blunt and less pleasant than in some other sources, but the reality is it's not all that different. And how can you see that? You see that the minute you hit the halachic sphere. because nobody talked about one word so far here in this whole thing about halakha, and talking about the Rebbe without halakha is like talking about guf b'li neshama, or maybe we should say neshama b'li guf, we should say. So at any rate, what's going on here is that if you'll take the case of shluchim in Africa helping non-Jews, this is just a very simple halachic thing. It's a halakha that Jews are supposed to help. Mefarsim, aniyeu mota olam. It's a halakha. Why is it a halakha? Because of exactly, Elliot quoted the stuff before. Elliot, you shouldn't say people should hate you for this, because you didn't say it in a way which is not right. It's fine. It's right. And the reality is, this is what's in the material. And I think that the problem is it's in a certain tension with other requirements of the halachic system. And the halachic system defines all human beings as one, at the same time as defining Jews as different, separate, or in some ways on a higher level, as you see in the Kabbalistic Hasidic sources. So, but this is the Am Segula and all this stuff. So what I'm simply saying here is that I think we sometimes have a problem of acting as if something in Chabad is unique to Chabad. It's just plain Judaism. And this happens very often, and it's something which has to be guarded against in our work. And so I also caution again in this particular case that we need to remember the halachic framework, and the halachic framework provides a certain set of lines of how much you differentiate and how much you don't differentiate, and where you differentiate. And I think that that's a very important point. That's why Elliot's point about the Rebbe not liking this kind of mixed identity scenario is right. But again, this is all based on things like shatnes, kilayim. There's a whole halachic principle of keeping things separate from other things. But we have to remember this hilchot tarovet.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Larry. But the only somewhat of a defense, we had to respond to a book, about Chabad. But you're absolutely right to broaden the canvas. And I think if I could say what you said in the paradoxical language that I like to use.
I love that. I love that.
It's always been the case that the sense of Israel's election is predicated on an exclusiveness that is inclusive of its own others. That's the paradox. And you're right that looking to halacha is actually a very important dimension of this.
I'll add one more defense. I think the term ritual, it's a general term, it's an academic term, but I think it overlaps with halacha. I don't think it exhausts halacha, but it overlaps with it. And the Rav Kook's book, Chavash Per, there are a few pages there which are sort of Kabbalistic, but it's 90% of it is a defense of Vinnegon's halachic position on moving the head feeling upwards rather than downwards. Yeah, so, okay.
One big example of taking something which is just plain Judaism is this whole business about reciprocity. This also sounds like Rabbi Soloveitchik's, covenantal community, but like Boker Tov. If you just read any of the Jewish sources throughout history. So I think that there's a lot of that going on. Okay, so thanks a lot. I actually do want to take a break before the session.
Good to see you.
I'm going to sign off, and I think I have to come back on the other link that I was given. Is that right, Jonah?
If you come on either link, I can make sure you're a panelist. Yeah.
Well,
All right.
I think we have time for one more question. If you guys have enough time, I think we'll have to make it a little short because I do want like 15 minutes of a break. So let's do a quick question with Kalman Newman. I'm going to promote you to panelist now so we can see and hear you. Might take a second. Wait for it. There we go. We still can't see or hear you, but we see that you're in the room.
Hi. Okay, hi, I'll be short. First, something very short for Professor Garb, if you ever publish it. Rav Kook's, the name of the book is Chava Green.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just happen to have it here on myself. The second thing is, Larry went off, but it's not, you know, the Rambam and Chabad have different understandings on the difference between Jews and non-Jews, right? Menachem Kellner has written 20 books on that, right? So it's not that this is a common issue, right? Chabad have more of a problem because they believe in an ontological difference, as Professor Wolfson said, right? Because the neshama of a non-Jew is different, and for the Rambam, there's no such issue. So the paradox is greater, the difficulties are greater. Okay, and I'll just end with a short anecdote, which I remembered. It connects two people who we're talking about now. I remember in one of his books, Hugo Bergman describes that he participates regularly in a shiur in Chabad that I believe was the shiur that Rabbi Steinsaltz used to give at the house of Shazar. He said, that's one of the shiurim I go to recently, but the only thing I'm not able to accept there is the constant repetition of the difference between the Jewish soul and the non-Jewish soul, because really Bergman was a type of religious humanist who could not accept that. Okay, thank you very much. I was really...
I would like to comment on your comment, if I may. So
Yeah.
Pekaj, between ideology and reality, he distinguishes between the philosophical sources and how they are, when they establish the commitment to social love, they are developing Aristotle ideas, and they're more universal. And he shows how the Hasidism uses and depends on the Kabbalistic traditions that are much more essentialist and differentiate between the essence of the Jewish soul and the Gentiles.
Exactly. Yeah. Precisely. Okay, so thank you very much. It was very, very, very...
But I just say, you're absolutely right about the Rambam not having the same problems. However, it's interesting that in the Mishnah Torah, V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, he says the Rea is the Jew, the Rambam.
The only source that I'm aware of that includes non-Jews in V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha is Sharei Kedusha of
Yeah, but my point is that this is important for the Rebbe because he follows the Rambam on this. But you're right. When you look at it from a more total picture, the Rambam doesn't have any of the problems that we're discussing. I agree with you. Yeah.
This is such a fascinating conversation. I wish we could have it all day, but we do have to stop now.
Thank you very much for letting
Again, later this evening or after the next session, we'll have another Zoom room that everyone can schmooze in for a little bit. But for now, we'll have to.
Thank you very much.
Thank our panelists so much for joining us and for taking the time. And I loved hearing you guys talk. So, and I guess we're off Facebook now, but everyone who's joined us to view, thank you so much too.
Thank you, Tony.
I'll leave the session open.
Yeah, I think so.
So there's people still that I think are going to stay on, the attendees.
Yeah.
So we'll just leave it open for now.